The summer of 1979 was particularly beautiful in Millfield, Pennsylvania, a small town nestled in the rolling hills between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. It was the kind of place where 3 generations of the same family might live within walking distance of each other, where the local newspaper still printed wedding announcements on the front page, and where everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. Catherine "Kathy" Morrison was the kind of young woman who seemed to embody everything hopeful about small-town America in the late 1970s. At 22, she possessed a radiant beauty that was entirely natural, honey-blonde hair that caught the light like spun gold, cornflower blue eyes that sparkled with intelligence and warmth, and a smile that could light up the entire Main Street diner where she worked as a waitress while saving money for college. Kathy had grown up on the modest side of Millfield, in a small house on Elm Street where her widowed mother, Helen Morrison, had raised her alone after Kathy's father died in a construction accident when she was 8 years old. Helen worked double shifts at the local textile factory to make ends meet, and Kathy had learned early the value of hard work and determination. Despite their humble circumstances, Kathy had always been one of the brightest students at Millfield High School. She dreamed of becoming a teacher, perhaps eventually earning enough money to help her mother retire from the exhausting factory work that was wearing down her health. But dreams like that required money for college tuition, and money was something the Morrison family had never had in abundance. Everything changed for Kathy during her senior year of high school, when she caught the attention of Jonathan Hayes, the only son of one of Millfield's most prominent families. The Hayes family owned the largest manufacturing company in the county, employed nearly half the town's workforce, and lived in a grand Victorian mansion on Hill Street that overlooked the rest of Millfield like a benevolent castle. Jonathan was handsome in the way that young men from wealthy families often are, tall and athletic with dark hair and confident green eyes, educated at private schools and destined for a leadership role in his father's business empire. He was 3 years older than Kathy, and had just returned from college when he first saw her serving coffee at Morrison's diner on a snowy February morning. Their courtship was the talk of Millfield. Jonathan would pick Kathy up after her shifts at the diner in his new Corvette, take her to expensive restaurants in neighboring towns, and shower her with gifts that she initially felt uncomfortable accepting. But Jonathan was persistent and charming, and Kathy found herself genuinely falling for his easy laugh and apparent sincerity. "He's not like what I expected," Kathy confided to her best friend Mary Ellen Davis, 6 months into their relationship. "I thought he'd be snobbish or condescending, but he's actually really interested in my thoughts and dreams. He listens when I talk about wanting to teach, and he says he admires how hard I work." Mary Ellen, who had grown up with Kathy and knew her better than anyone, was more cautious in her assessment of the relationship. "Just be careful, Kathy," she warned. "The Hayes family has certain expectations about who their son should marry. Make sure Jonathan is serious about you before you get too attached." But Jonathan seemed entirely serious. When he proposed to Kathy on Christmas Eve 1978, he did so in front of both their families at the Hayes Mansion's annual holiday party, presenting her with a diamond ring that must have cost more than Helen Morrison earned in a year. The engagement announcement made the front page of the Millfield Gazette, complete with a photograph of the radiant couple, and speculation about what would surely be the social event of the year. The wedding was planned for June 16, 1979, at the historic St. Peter's Chapel, a small stone church that had been built in 1887 and had hosted the weddings of Millfield's most prominent families for nearly a century. The Hayes family spared no expense in planning the celebration, hiring caterers from Philadelphia and arranging for flowers to be flown in from New York. Kathy threw herself into wedding preparations with the enthusiasm of a young woman living out her deepest dreams. She spent hours poring over bridal magazines with her mother, choosing everything from the pattern of the china to the style of the bridesmaids' dresses. The wedding dress itself was a masterpiece of lace and silk that had been ordered from an exclusive boutique in Manhattan. But as the wedding date approached, people close to Kathy began to notice subtle changes in her behavior. She seemed increasingly anxious and distracted, often staring off into space during conversations and jumping at unexpected sounds. Mary Ellen noticed that Kathy had lost weight and that dark circles had appeared under her eyes, as if she wasn't sleeping well. "Are you having second thoughts about the wedding?" Mary Ellen asked during one of their regular coffee dates in early June. "It's completely normal to feel nervous before such a big step." Kathy's response was evasive. "It's not second thoughts exactly," she said, stirring her coffee absently. "It's just Sometimes I feel like I don't really know Jonathan as well as I thought I did. There are parts of his life, his family's life, that he doesn't talk about. And when I ask questions, he changes the subject. Mary Ellen pressed for details, but Kathy seemed reluctant to elaborate. She mentioned overhearing phone conversations that Jonathan quickly ended when she entered the room, discovering locked drawers in his desk that he claimed contained boring business papers, and sensing tension in the Hayes household that no one would explain. Maybe I'm just imagining things, Kathy concluded. Wedding stress can make you paranoid about everything, right? But Kathy's concerns weren't entirely imaginary. Unknown to her, the Hayes family was indeed harboring secrets that went to the very heart of their wealth and influence in Millfield. The family's manufacturing business had thrived for decades partly through legitimate success, but also through connections to organized crime figures who used the company's shipping operations to move illegal goods throughout Pennsylvania and beyond. Jonathan's father, Robert Hayes, had inherited these arrangements from his own father and had continued them out of a combination of greed and fear. The criminal associations that had helped build the Hayes fortune had also created dangerous obligations that couldn't be easily dissolved. When Jonathan brought Kathy into the family, he was unknowingly exposing her to a world of violence and corruption that she could never have imagined. The first concrete sign of trouble came on June 10th, 6 days before the wedding, when Kathy received an unexpected visitor at the diner. A well-dressed stranger who identified himself only as Mr. Vincent asked to speak with her privately during her break. He was a middle-aged man with cold eyes and an expensive suit who claimed to be a business associate of the Hayes family. "Miss Morrison," he said as they sat in a corner booth away from other customers, "I want to congratulate you on your upcoming marriage. The Hayes family is very important to our organization. I trust you understand the significance of joining such a prominent family." Kathy felt immediately uncomfortable with the man's tone and the veiled implications of his words. "I'm not sure what you mean," she replied carefully. "Jonathan and I are getting married because we love each other, Mr. Vincent smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, love is wonderful, but marriage also creates certain responsibilities. Wives of important men need to understand the importance of loyalty and discretion. They need to know when to ask questions and when to simply trust that their husbands are handling complicated matters appropriately." The conversation lasted only 10 minutes, but it left Kathy deeply shaken. Mr. Vincent had never explicitly threatened her, but his meaning was clear. Her marriage to Jonathan would involve her in aspects of the Hayes family business that she wouldn't understand and shouldn't question. That evening, Kathy tried to discuss the encounter with Jonathan, but his reaction only increased her concerns. He became visibly agitated when she described Mr. Vincent, pacing around his apartment and running his hands through his hair in obvious distress. "You shouldn't have talked to him," Jonathan said, his voice tight with anxiety. "These are business matters that you don't need to worry about. After we're married, you'll understand that some aspects of my family's affairs need to remain private." "What kind of affairs?" Kathy asked. "Jonathan, what exactly does your family's company do that requires this level of secrecy?" Jonathan's response was to take her hands and look directly into her eyes with an intensity that was almost frightening. "Kathy, I need you to trust me. There are things about my family's business that are complicated, but I'm working to change that. After we're married, after I have more influence in the company, I'll be able to make things cleaner. But right now I need you to not ask questions and not talk to people like Mr. Vincent." The conversation ended with Jonathan's promise that everything would be different after their wedding, but Kathy left his apartment feeling more confused and frightened than ever. She spent the next few days in a state of growing anxiety, torn between her love for Jonathan and her increasing certainty that marrying him would involve her in something dangerous and morally questionable. 3 days before the wedding, Kathy's mother noticed her daughter's distress and confronted her about it. Helen Morrison was a woman who had faced her share of hardships and had developed a keen ability to sense when something was seriously wrong. "Kathy, honey, what's going on?" Helen asked as they sat in their small kitchen after dinner. "You've been a bundle of nerves for weeks and you look like you haven't slept in days. If you're having doubts about Jonathan, it's not too late to postpone the wedding." For a moment, Kathy seemed on the verge of confiding everything to her mother, but then she shook her head and forced a smile. "It's just pre-wedding jitters, Mom. Every bride goes through this, right? I'll be fine once the ceremony is over, and we can start our new life together." But Helen Morrison wasn't convinced. She had worked in Millfield's factories and diners long enough to hear rumors about the Hayes family's business practices, and she had always harbored private doubts about the wisdom of her daughter marrying into such a wealthy and powerful family. Wealth like that, she believed, was rarely acquired through entirely legitimate means. The night before the wedding, June 15, 1979, Kathy attended her rehearsal dinner at the Hayes mansion with apparent good spirits. She laughed at Jonathan's jokes, graciously accepted congratulations from the assembled guests, and played the role of the happy bride-to-be with convincing enthusiasm. But Mary Ellen, who knew Kathy better than anyone, could see the strain beneath her friend's cheerful facade. During a brief moment when they were alone in the mansion's powder room, Mary Ellen pulled Kathy aside. "Kathy, you can tell me the truth," she said urgently. "Are you really okay with all this? Because if you're not, we can figure out a way to get you out of here. You don't have to go through with the wedding if you're having serious doubts." Kathy's composure finally cracked and tears began streaming down her carefully made-up face. "Mary Ellen, I think I've gotten myself into something terrible. I think Jonathan's family is involved in illegal activities, and I'm afraid that marrying him will make me part of it. But I don't know how to get out without making things worse." Mary Ellen was shocked by the revelation, but immediately focused on helping her friend. "We'll figure this out," she promised. "You don't have to face this alone. Maybe we should talk to the police or—" "No," Kathy interrupted, her voice sharp with fear. "No police. If I'm right about what the Hayes family is involved in, going to the police could be dangerous. I need to think this through carefully." The two friends talked for another few minutes before they were interrupted by Jonathan, who came looking for his fiancée. Kathy quickly composed herself and returned to the party, but Mary Ellen remained deeply concerned about her friend's situation. The rehearsal dinner ended around 11 o'clock, with Kathy returning to her mother's house and Jonathan going back to his apartment, following the traditional custom of the bride and groom not seeing each other on their wedding day until the ceremony. Helen Morrison was already asleep when Kathy came home, exhausted from working an extra shift to take the next day off for the wedding. Kathy went to her room and sat on the bed she had slept in since childhood, surrounded by the wedding gifts and preparations that now felt like evidence of a terrible mistake. At midnight, Kathy made a decision. She couldn't go through with the wedding without knowing more about what she was getting herself into. She needed to find concrete evidence of the Hayes family's activities, something that would either confirm her fears or put them to rest once and for all. Kathy knew that Jonathan kept important papers in his home office, in the locked desk drawers he had deflected her questions about. If she could get into his apartment and examine those documents, she might finally understand what kind of business her future husband's family was really involved in. At 12:30 in the morning, 6 hours before her wedding was scheduled to begin, Kathy Morrison slipped out of her mother's house and drove to Jonathan's apartment complex in her aging Volkswagen Beetle. She had a key to his apartment. He had given it to her 3 months earlier as a symbol of his trust and commitment. The apartment building was dark and silent as Kathy let herself into Jonathan's unit. She made her way to his home office, using the flashlight she had brought to avoid turning on lights that might alert neighbors or security. The locked desk drawers yielded to a letter opener she found in another drawer, and what she discovered inside changed everything. The documents in Jonathan's desk told a story that was worse than her darkest suspicions. Financial records showed payments to individuals with obviously false names, shipping manifests that listed cargo that didn't match the listed destinations, and correspondence with known organized crime figures that made it clear the Hayes family business was deeply involved in drug trafficking and money laundering. But the most shocking discovery was a series of photographs and documents that revealed Jonathan himself was not the innocent young man she had believed him to be. He had been actively involved in his family's criminal enterprises for years, and his pursuit of Kathy had been partially motivated by his father's belief that marrying a local girl from a working-class family would help legitimize their operations and deflect suspicion from law enforcement. As Kathy sat in Jonathan's office, reading document after document that shattered her illusions about the man she had planned to marry in a few hours, she began to formulate a plan. She couldn't simply call off the wedding without explanation. That would raise questions that could put her in danger. But she also couldn't go through with marrying someone who had deceived her so completely about who he really was. She decided to confront Jonathan privately before the ceremony, to give him a chance to explain and to tell him that she couldn't marry him under these circumstances. She hoped that their personal relationship had been genuine enough that he would let her leave quietly without involving his family's criminal associates. But as Kathy was preparing to leave Jonathan's apartment, she heard the sound of a key in the front door lock. Someone was coming into the apartment, and she was trapped in the office with stolen documents spread across the desk. Panicking, Kathy quickly gathered the papers and photographs, stuffed them into her purse, and looked for a way to escape without being discovered. The office had a window that opened onto a fire escape, and she managed to climb out just as she heard footsteps in the hallway approaching the office. From her position on the fire escape, Kathy could see into the apartment and recognize the voices of Jonathan and his father, Robert Hayes. They were discussing wedding preparations, but their conversation quickly turned to business matters that confirmed everything Kathy had learned from the documents. "The Morrison girl seems completely naive about our operations," Robert Hayes was saying. "That makes her perfect for our purposes. A loyal, unsuspecting wife will be valuable for maintaining our legitimate facade." Jonathan's response shocked Kathy even more than his father's cynical assessment. "She's been asking more questions lately," he said. "I think someone might have talked to her about our business activities. We may need to be more careful about what she has access to after the wedding." "Questions can be managed," Robert Hayes replied coldly. "Wives who ask too many questions sometimes find themselves in unfortunate accidents. The important thing is that the marriage proceeds as planned. We've invested too much in this alliance to let it fall apart now." The casual mention of violence against her made Kathy's blood run cold. These men were discussing her as if she were a business asset rather than a human being, and they were clearly prepared to eliminate her if she became inconvenient. Kathy remained on the fire escape until the two men left the apartment, then climbed back inside to retrieve anything she might have missed. She took additional documents that seemed particularly incriminating, including what appeared to be financial records showing bribes paid to local law enforcement officials. By 3 o'clock in the morning, Kathy was back in her car, driving through the empty streets of Millfield with her mind racing. She couldn't go home. Her mother would ask too many questions, and Kathy didn't want to put her in danger. She couldn't go to the police. The documents she had stolen suggested that several local officers were on the Hayes family payroll. She decided to go to St. Peter's Chapel, where her wedding was supposed to take place in just a few hours. The historic stone church had always been a place of comfort for her, and she needed time to think and plan her next move. The chapel was dark and empty when Kathy arrived, but she had attended services there since childhood and knew that the side door was never locked. Pastor Williams believed that God's house should always be open to those who needed sanctuary. Kathy made her way into the chapel's main sanctuary, where dozens of white flowers and candles were already arranged for the wedding ceremony. The sight of the altar where she was supposed to pledge her life to Jonathan just a few hours later brought tears to her eyes. She sat in the front pew and tried to formulate a plan. She could simply disappear, leave town immediately, and start a new life somewhere else. But that would mean abandoning her mother and leaving behind everyone she cared about. It would also mean that Jonathan and his family would continue their criminal activities without consequence. Alternatively, she could try to take the evidence she had gathered to federal authorities who wouldn't be influenced by the Hayes family's local corruption. But that would be dangerous and might not be believed without additional proof. As Kathy sat in the chapel struggling with these impossible choices, she heard the sound of a car pulling into the parking lot. Looking through the stained glass windows, she saw Jonathan's Corvette and felt her heart begin to race with fear. Jonathan entered the chapel alone, calling her name softly. He had apparently discovered that she had been in his apartment and had somehow tracked her to the church. "Kathy, I know you're in here," he said, his voice echoing in the empty sanctuary. "We need to talk about what you found tonight. I can explain everything." Kathy remained hidden in the shadows near the altar, clutching her purse containing the stolen documents. She was trapped in the chapel with nowhere to run, facing the man she had thought she loved but who now represented a mortal threat. "I know this looks bad," Jonathan continued, walking slowly down the center aisle toward the altar. "But you have to understand that I never wanted to be involved in my family's business activities. I was trying to protect you from all of that." Despite her fear, Kathy found her voice. "Protect me," she called out from her hiding place. "I heard you and your father talking about managing me, about accidents happening to wives who ask too many questions. That doesn't sound like protection." Jonathan stopped walking, and when he spoke again, his tone had changed. The warmth and charm that had attracted Kathy to him were gone, replaced by something colder and more calculating. "You shouldn't have been listening to private conversations, Kathy, and you definitely shouldn't have taken documents that don't belong to you." Those papers contain information that could be very dangerous in the wrong hands. They contain evidence of crimes, Kathy replied, stepping out from behind the altar so she could see Jonathan's face. Drug trafficking, money laundering, bribery of police officers. How long did you think you could hide this from me? Jonathan's expression was a mixture of regret and determination. I hoped I could gradually bring you into the family business after we were married. You're intelligent and loyal. You could have been valuable to our operations, but if you can't accept the reality of our situation, then we have a problem. The threat in his words was unmistakable. Kathy realized that her former fiancé was prepared to silence her permanently, rather than allow her to expose his family's criminal empire. The wedding is supposed to start in 3 hours, Kathy said, trying to keep her voice steady. What exactly are you planning to do? Jonathan moved closer to the altar, and Kathy could see that he was holding something in his right hand, a small pistol that glinted in the candlelight. I'm planning to solve this problem quickly and quietly, he said. You're going to give me those documents, and then we're going to have a tragic accident. A young bride, overwhelmed by pre-wedding stress, takes her own life in the chapel where she was supposed to be married. It's actually quite poetic, but Kathy had not survived 22 years of hardship and poverty without developing a strong survival instinct. As Jonathan raised the pistol, she threw herself sideways behind the heavy wooden altar, using the massive structure as a shield. You can't cover this up, Jonathan, she shouted. People will ask questions. Mary Ellen knows I was suspicious about your family's business. My mother will never believe I took my own life. Jonathan's laugh was cold and humorless. My family has been covering up inconvenient problems for decades, Kathy. We're very good at it. Your friend Mary Ellen will be told that you confessed your doubts about the marriage to me, and that you couldn't face the shame of calling off such an elaborate wedding. Your mother will grieve, but she'll accept the official explanation. The sound of the chapel door opening again made both Kathy and Jonathan freeze. Someone else had arrived, though Kathy couldn't see who it was from her position behind the altar. Jonathan, called a voice that Kathy recognized as belonging to Robert Hayes. Is everything under control here? Almost, Jonathan replied. She has the documents, but she's being stubborn about returning them. Robert Hayes walked down the aisle until he was standing beside his son, and Kathy could see that he too was armed. The situation had gone from dangerous to hopeless in a matter of seconds. Miss Morrison, Robert Hayes called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. You're in a position where cooperation is your only option for survival. Return the documents you stole, and we can discuss arrangements for your future that don't involve tragedy. Kathy knew that any arrangements the Hayes family made for her would likely be fatal, but she also understood that she was completely trapped. The chapel had only one exit, and both men were positioned between her and the door. What kind of arrangements? She asked, buying time while trying to think of any possible escape route. We could arrange for you to relocate to another city, Robert Hayes replied smoothly. A new identity, enough money to start fresh somewhere far from Millfield. All you have to do is forget what you learned tonight and never contact anyone from your old life again. The offer was obviously a lie, but Kathy played along while examining her surroundings for any advantage she could exploit. The chapel was built in the 1880s and had several architectural features that might provide opportunities for escape or concealment. How do I know you'll keep your word? She asked. You don't, Robert Hayes admitted, but considering your current situation, trusting our word is a much better option than the alternatives we're prepared to implement. As the conversation continued, Kathy noticed something that gave her a glimmer of hope. The chapel's floor near the altar was covered with ancient wooden planks that had warped and shifted over the decades of use. Some of the planks near the back wall appeared to be loose, and she remembered hearing rumors that the chapel had been used as part of the Underground Railroad in the 1860s, with hidden spaces for concealing escaped slaves. If there was indeed a hidden room beneath the chapel floor, it might provide her with a way to escape or at least a place to hide until help arrived. But reaching the loose planks would require her to move away from the protection of the altar, exposing herself to the armed men who were hunting her. The conversation had reached an impasse, with Robert and Jonathan Hayes growing increasingly impatient with Kathy's stalling tactics. She could hear them whispering to each other, apparently planning their next move. I need a minute to think about your offer, Kathy called out, trying to buy more time. You've had enough time, Jonathan replied, his voice sharp with frustration. Make your decision now, or we'll make it for you. Kathy realized that her only chance was to make a desperate attempt to reach the loose floorboards. She counted to 3, then sprinted from behind the altar toward the back wall of the chapel. hoping to catch the two men off guard. Her gamble partially worked. Jonathan and his father were surprised by her sudden movement and hesitated for a crucial second before pursuing her. But as Kathy reached the loose floorboards and began trying to pry them up with her hands, she heard Jonathan's footsteps rapidly approaching. The first board came loose more easily than she had expected, revealing a dark space beneath the chapel floor. Without hesitation, Kathy dropped through the opening into the hidden room below, landing hard on a dirt floor approximately 8 feet beneath the chapel's main level. The space was completely dark, but Kathy could feel that it was larger than she had expected, a genuine room rather than just a crawl space. She crawled away from the opening as quickly as possible, hoping to find another exit or at least a secure hiding place. Above her, she could hear Jonathan and Robert Hayes arguing about how to pursue her into the hidden space. They had apparently brought flashlights, and beams of light began probing through the opening she had used to escape. "There's no other way out of there," Robert Hayes was saying. "She's trapped like a rat in a hole. We just need to wait for her to come out." But as Kathy explored the hidden room with her hands, she discovered that Robert Hayes was wrong. The space was indeed a room, approximately 12 feet square, with stone walls that seemed to be part of the chapel's original foundation, and along one wall she found what felt like a wooden door. The door was locked, but the wood was old and partially rotted. Kathy was able to force it open by throwing her weight against it repeatedly. Beyond the door was a narrow tunnel that seemed to extend away from the chapel toward the adjacent cemetery. The tunnel was barely wide enough for a single person to crawl through, and Kathy had no idea where it led. But with Jonathan and Robert Hayes above her, and no other options available, she began making her way through the underground passage. The tunnel was approximately 50 yards long and ended at another wooden door that opened into what appeared to be a maintenance shed in the cemetery behind the chapel. Kathy emerged into the pre-dawn darkness, gasping with relief and covered in dirt from her underground escape. But her relief was short-lived. As she tried to decide her next move, she heard the sound of car engines starting in the chapel parking lot. Jonathan and Robert Hayes had apparently realized that she had escaped and were mobilizing to search for her. Kathy made her way through the cemetery toward the street, staying low behind tombstones and monuments to avoid being spotted. Her car was still parked at the chapel, but returning to retrieve it would be too dangerous. She needed to find another way to get out of Millfield and contact authorities who could help her. As she reached the edge of the cemetery, Kathy realized that her purse containing the stolen documents that proved the Hayes family's criminal activities was no longer with her. She must have dropped it during her escape through the hidden room or the tunnel. Without the evidence she had risked everything to obtain, her word alone would never be enough to convince authorities to investigate one of Millfield's most respected families. The documents were the only proof she had of the Hayes family's criminal empire, and now they were lost somewhere in the hidden spaces beneath St. Peter's Chapel. Kathy spent the rest of the night hiding in the woods outside Millfield, afraid to approach anyone for help, and unsure whether she could trust local law enforcement. As dawn broke and the time for her wedding ceremony arrived, she watched from a distance as confused guests gathered at the chapel, waiting for a bride who would never appear. By mid-morning, when it became clear that Kathy had vanished completely, a massive search effort was launched. Police, volunteers, and even some members of the Hayes family participated in looking for the missing bride, though Jonathan and Robert Hayes knew exactly why she had disappeared. The official investigation treated Kathy's disappearance as a case of a young woman who had gotten cold feet about her wedding and run away to start a new life elsewhere. There was no evidence of foul play, no signs of struggle, and no indication that she had been taken against her will. Jonathan Hayes played the role of the heartbroken fiancé with convincing skill, publicly expressing his hope that Kathy would return and his willingness to forgive her for any doubts she might have had about their marriage. Privately, he and his father continued searching for her, knowing that she remained a threat to their operations as long as she was alive and free. But Kathy Morrison had effectively vanished from the face of the earth. Over the following weeks and months, reported sightings came from cities across the country, but none were ever confirmed. The FBI eventually became involved in the case, but their investigation also failed to produce any credible leads about her whereabouts. Helen Morrison never accepted that her daughter had voluntarily abandoned her family and friends. She continued searching for Kathy for years, hiring private investigators and following up on every possible lead. But as time passed without any breakthrough, even she began to lose hope of ever learning the truth about what had happened to her daughter. Mary Ellen Davis, Kathy's best friend, also refused to believe the official explanation. She knew Kathy too well to accept that she would disappear without explanation, especially when she had been so close to her mother. Mary Ellen became convinced that something terrible had happened to Kathy, and she spent years trying to prove that the Hayes family was somehow involved in her disappearance. But without evidence or cooperation from local authorities, Mary Ellen's investigation made little progress. The Hayes family's influence in Millfield was too strong, and their resources were too extensive for a single person to challenge successfully. The decades that followed Kathy's disappearance saw significant changes in Millfield and the Hayes family fortunes. Jonathan Hayes eventually married someone else, a woman from another wealthy family who apparently had no qualms about the source of her husband's wealth. The family business continued to prosper, though law enforcement pressure in the 1980s and 1990s forced them to scale back their more obviously criminal activities. Robert Hayes died in 1995, taking many of his secrets to the grave. Jonathan inherited control of the family business and gradually transformed it into a more legitimate operation, though rumors persisted that he maintained connections to organized crime figures. St. Peter's Chapel continued to host weddings and religious services for decades after Kathy's disappearance, though the events of that June night in 1979 cast a shadow over the historic building. Some members of the congregation reported feeling an unexplained sense of sadness or unease in the chapel, particularly near the altar where Kathy was supposed to have been married. By 2009, 30 years after Kathy Morrison vanished, most of Millfield's residents had either forgotten the story or relegated it to local folklore. The case officially remained open, but no active investigation was being pursued. Kathy would have been 52 years old, possibly married to someone else, possibly the mother of children who had never heard of Millfield, Pennsylvania. The truth about what happened to her seemed destined to remain one of those mysteries that small towns accumulate over the generations, a story that gets retold at diners and barbershops, with details that change slightly with each telling, until the facts become indistinguishable from speculation. But in the spring of 2009, St. Peter's Chapel required major renovations to address structural problems that had developed over its 122-year history. The church board hired Patterson Construction, a regional company with experience in historic preservation, to oversee the project. The renovation work began in April with an examination of the chapel's foundation and support structures. Workers discovered that some of the stone foundation blocks had shifted over the decades, creating stability problems that needed to be addressed before other work could proceed. It was during this foundation inspection that construction foreman Mike Patterson made a discovery that would finally solve the mystery of Kathy Morrison's disappearance. While examining the area beneath the chapel's altar, Patterson noticed that some of the wooden floor planks appeared to have been disturbed at some point in the past. When the workers removed these planks to inspect the foundation underneath, they found the entrance to a hidden room that no one involved in the renovation project had known existed. The room appeared to be part of the chapel's original construction, possibly designed as a storage space or hiding place during the building's early years. But the room contained more than just historical artifacts. Scattered across the dirt floor were dozens of documents and photographs that appeared to be related to business and financial matters. And in one corner of the room, partially concealed beneath decades of accumulated debris, were the skeletal remains of a human being. The discovery was immediately reported to the Millfield Police Department, and within hours the chapel was declared a crime scene. The Pennsylvania State Police were called in to assist with the investigation, and forensic specialists from the FBI crime lab were requested to examine the remains and other evidence. The documents found in the hidden room proved to be the same papers that Kathy Morrison had stolen from Jonathan Hayes' apartment 30 years earlier. They contained detailed records of financial transactions that clearly implicated the Hayes family in drug trafficking, money laundering, and corruption of local officials. But it was the identification of the skeletal remains that provided the final piece of the puzzle. Dental records confirmed that the bones belonged to Catherine Morrison, the bride who had vanished on her wedding eve in 1979. The condition of the remains and their position in the hidden room told a story of murder rather than accident or suicide. Forensic analysis revealed evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull, indicating that Kathy had been killed by repeated blows to the head. The investigation into the 30-year-old murder was complicated by the passage of time and the death of several key figures, including Robert Hayes. But the documents found with Kathy's remains provided a clear motive for her killing, and investigators were able to piece together the events of that fateful night in June 1979. The evidence suggested that Jonathan and Robert Hayes had pursued Kathy into the hidden room beneath the chapel, where they had beaten her to death to prevent her from exposing their criminal activities. They had then sealed the room and allowed the official investigation to conclude that she had run away. Jonathan Hayes, now in his 70s and suffering from failing health, was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The case attracted national media attention, as the story of the missing bride and the hidden room captured public imagination. During the trial, prosecutors presented evidence that the Hayes family had been involved in organized crime activities for decades, using their legitimate business operations as a front for drug trafficking and money laundering. Kathy Morrison had stumbled onto this secret world and had been killed to prevent her from exposing it. Jonathan Hayes' defense team argued that their client had been a young man under his father's influence and that Robert Hayes had been the one responsible for Kathy's death. But the evidence was overwhelming, and Jonathan's own statements to investigators contained inconsistencies that undermined his credibility. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. Jonathan Hayes was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, finally facing justice for a crime that had gone unpunished for 3 decades. Helen Morrison, now in her 80s, lived long enough to see her daughter's killer convicted. She had never stopped believing that Kathy had been murdered, and the discovery of her remains provided a painful but necessary closure to a tragedy that had defined her life. "I always knew my Kathy didn't run away," Helen told reporters after the trial. "She was a good girl who loved her family. Someone took her from us, and I'm grateful that the truth finally came out, even though it took 30 years. Mary Ellen Davis, who had never stopped investigating her friend's disappearance, felt vindicated by the discovery, but also saddened by the confirmation of her worst fears. "Kathy was trying to do the right thing," she said. "She discovered that the man she was going to marry was involved in criminal activities, and instead of ignoring it or running away, she tried to gather evidence. That courage cost her her life." The hidden room beneath St. Peter's Chapel was permanently sealed after the investigation concluded, but a memorial plaque was installed near the altar to honor Kathy Morrison's memory. The chapel's congregation voted to establish a scholarship fund in her name, supporting young women from working-class families who wanted to pursue college education. The case also led to a broader investigation into the Hayes family's business activities and their connections to organized crime. Several other unsolved cases from the 1970s and 1980s were reopened, and investigators discovered evidence linking the family to additional crimes that had been covered up over the decades. The Kathy Morrison case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of corruption and the importance of speaking truth to power, even when doing so involves personal risk. Her story inspired changes in how law enforcement agencies handle missing persons cases, particularly those involving potential victims who might have uncovered evidence of criminal activities. St. Peter's Chapel continues to host weddings and religious services, but the building now carries the weight of history and the memory of a young woman whose courage in the face of danger ultimately helped expose a criminal conspiracy that had operated with impunity for decades. The bride who vanished on her wedding eve in 1979 had finally come home, and her long journey toward justice had revealed truths that transformed an entire community's understanding of power, corruption, and the price of standing up for what is right. Catherine Morrison's legacy lives on not just in the scholarship fund that bears her name, but in the reminder that sometimes the most important battles are fought by ordinary people who refuse to accept that wrongdoing should go unchallenged, regardless of who is responsible or how powerful they might be. Her story proves that truth, however long buried, has a way of eventually surfacing, and that justice, though delayed, can ultimately prevail over corruption and violence. The hidden room beneath the chapel had kept its secrets for 30 years, but in the end it became the means by which those secrets were finally revealed to the world.